Welcome back to another video. In this one, we'll be talking about how to develop thesis statements and claims throughout an argument. This video will be in two parts. The first part is going to cover thesis statements and how to write a defensible one. We'll talk about prompt analysis by examining the 3 different essay prompts on the AP exam, and then I'll give you some templates to help you write a defensible thesis statement. The second part of the video will be about body paragraph composition or claim development. We'll talk about how to write explicit, effective claims, how to select your evidence, and how to integrate your evidence. And so let's get started talking about thesis writing. To begin, we're going to talk about how you analyze a rhetorical situation, or in the case of your AP exam, how you analyze a prompt. Then we'll dig into how to write a defensible statement. Let's go over the process for pre-writing, or all of the planning you do before you start writing your essay. Research shows that the best breakdown of how to use your time in a timed writing situation like you'll do on your AP exam is to spend 25% of the allotted time on pre-writing. Now, on the day of the test, that can seem like a lot of time slipping away. However, effective pre-writing makes the rest of the process so much easier. And so here's the basic process. Start by analyzing your prompt. We're going to go through this together. Determine then your position and the reasoning or approach you're going to take. And third, outline briefly what your essay is going to look like. The advantage of taking these steps up front means that writing the essay is going to go incredibly smoother and be a lot faster. So in this video, we'll spend most of our time talking about how to analyze the 3 writing prompts on the AP exam. However, it's important that you can analyze writing prompts in multiple contexts, like your ACT, the SAT writing tests, or college writing assignments in the future. To do so, there are 3 simple steps that can help you analyze any writing prompt. The first, or P, is for purpose, to identify what you need to accomplish or what your writing task is. In other words, what is the desired effect or outcome, just like when we analyze the rhetorical situation of someone else. The next thing you need to think about is the audience. Who are they? What are their beliefs? What are their needs? And maybe more importantly, what are they expecting? In a writing task, this can mean what are the requirements? What do they expect to see in my writing? And the third thing to look at in the prompt is the type of writing it's asking you to do. Does it want something persuasive, informative, narrative style? Essentially, figure out what genre of writing is expected for the prompt that's provided. But we're here for AP language, so let's talk about the free response questions. The free response questions are 3 essay questions that make up the second part of your AP language exam and count for 55% of the overall score. They include 3 different prompts or questions. The first question is called the synthesis question, and it asks you to compose a persuasive essay synthesizing information from multiple sources. It comes with a cover page that asks or outlines your prompt and task, and then provides multiple sources that you synthesize to develop your position on the given prompt. Question 2 is sometimes the more unfamiliar, but it's called the rhetorical analysis. And what you do in the rhetorical analysis is you analyze the rhetorical choices made by an author to achieve their purpose. So it's more analytic writing than persuasive writing. Then there's question 3, which is called the argument or open response. It is another persuasive essay, but this time the evidence needs to come from you. Let's take a stab at question 1, or the synthesis prompt. On the next slide, I've provided a question 1 prompt. What I'd like you to do in your notes is to identify the purpose, the audience, and the task. Urban rewilding is an effort to restore natural ecological processes and habitats in city environments. Many cities around the world have embraced rewilding as part of larger movements to promote ecological conservation and environmentally friendly design. Now, a movement to promote urban rewilding is beginning to take shape in the United States as well. Carefully read the 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources, and develop your position on the extent to which rewilding initiatives are worthwhile for urban communities to pursue. Source A is an infographic from Fastnatch. Source B is by Jepson and Shepard's policy brief. Source C is an NRPA article. Source D is a Garland article. Source E is a graph from McDonald et al. And Source F is a Chatterton book excerpt. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible position. Select and use evidence from at least 3 of the provided sources to support your line of reasoning. Indicate clearly the sources used through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. Sources may be cited as source A, source B, etc., or by using the descriptions in parentheses. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. Use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. So let's break down this prompt together, starting with the purpose. In this case, as indicated on the screen, the purpose for this one is to develop a position on the extent to which rewilding initiatives are worthwhile for urban communities to pursue. The audience for this particular prompt is obviously going to be your AP readers, but there are requirements outlined at the bottom for what they expect to see. Finally, the type of writing is a persuasive essay, and I know this because it says develop a position, meaning that I need to bring my own opinion to this topic. A few years ago, the College Board adopted what's called stable wording for their free response questions. Stable wording is standard language used in the development of AP language free response questions and prompts. In other words, it's language that's used consistently from year to year to keep the questions similar in design. We'll go through the 3 different prompts and the 3 different types of stable wording you can expect on your test. Take a second to review the stable wording for question 1 or the synthesis prompt. I've underlined what I call the signal phrase. The signal phrase always precedes the task or the purpose of your writing that's being outlined in the prompt. If you notice, question 1 always provides 3 things in its task. 1, it asks you to synthesize, meaning bringing information from multiple different sources. It asks you to use 3 sources at least, and it asks you to develop your own position. Now let's look at the stable wording for question 2. You'll notice there's a lot italicized and in brackets with the rhetorical analysis stable wording. That's because it's going to change depending on the passage you're provided to analyze. However, there is still a consistent signal phrase that's used to precede the task. It says, write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices, and then it will go on to identify the unique writer and narrow the focus for you as the reader. You'll notice, in contrast to question 1, that this is not asking for your position on something necessarily. It's not asking you to persuade an audience. It's asking you to analyze. Now, analyzing does mean taking a position, but instead of an opinion on a subject, you're taking a position on the choices you identify in the writer's writing. Those rhetorical choices that you analyze throughout the essay are really what develop your position in this case. Finally, let's look at the stable wording for question 3, and you'll notice pretty quickly that there isn't much provided in terms of consistent phrases that are used over and over again. However, there is still a signal phrase that is always going to appear in your question 3 prompts. It says, write an essay that argues your position on, and then it will provide more specific related to the topic. In this case, you're arguing, which means this is a persuasive essay, and you're developing, again, your position on the issue or topic. If you didn't notice, the stable wording uses the same 3 words as the signal phrase in all 3 of the free response questions, and that is write an essay. When you are analyzing your prompts for the AP exam, look for that phrase because whatever follows it immediately after, that is your writing task. So once you've analyzed the prompt, the next step is to develop your own position. And what that looks like in an essay is your thesis statement. The AP rubric specifically states it wants a defensible thesis statement. What that means is that your thesis statement is specific, it's not too broad or general, it's arguable, meaning that you take a clear position on the issue or topic, and third, it is appropriate to the provided task. Let's look at a couple examples to distinguish what a defensible thesis looks like versus an indefensible thesis. On the next slide, I've provided a prompt using the stable wording for question 2. Then I've provided 2 thesis statements. Let's see if you can determine which one is defensible. Let's start by reading the prompt. It's one that I've created using the stable wording for question 2, the rhetorical analysis. You'll notice I've gone ahead and underlined the task statement to help you really zero in on what the defensible thesis should be addressing. Let's read. John Boyega, an actor best known for playing Finn in the new Star Wars installments, gave an impromptu speech during the George Floyd protests of police brutality in London on June 3, 2020. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Boyega makes to convey his argument that change is necessary and attainable through joint effort. Let's look at our first example thesis statement. Boyega makes the argument that Black individuals need to fight racism. Pause the video and in your notes, copy down that example and explain whether or not you think it's a defensible thesis statement. All right, let's look at example 2. Boyega calls protesters to action through direct address and repetition. Again, copy the example down into your notes and decide if you think it is a defensible thesis statement. All right, let's look at these two examples of thesis statements. The first one was not defensible. Let's explain why. The point of question 2 is to analyze a passage for rhetorical choices the speaker makes. If you read the statement, Boyega makes the argument that Black individuals need to fight racism. There really is no sign of rhetorical choices or choices that Boyega made to convince his audience. Instead, it's rather just a summary of the speech or passage. This would not earn the thesis point on the AP rubric. The second example, however, would because it is defensible. It clearly outlines two rhetorical choices, in this case, direct address and repetition, that Boyega is making to call the protesters to action. It may be a simple thesis statement, but it is defensible and effective. Now, fortunately, because College Board has implemented stable wording, there are a few surefire templates that you can use to compose a defensible thesis statement for the different types of free response questions. Now, I'm actually going to start with question 2 because it uses a different template than the other two free response questions, 1 and 3. That's because the task for question 2 is to analyze rhetorical choices for a provided passage. Therefore, instead of a more persuasive thesis, we need an analytic thesis. And my go-to formula is who plus how plus why. In this case, the who is our speaker. Using our previous prompt, that would be Boyega. The how are the choices that speaker uses to prove their point or achieve their purpose. Those would be those rhetorical choices like direct address or repetition. And finally, it should have why or the author's overall purpose, just like we talked about in previous units with the rhetorical situation. A defensible thesis for question 2 is going to identify these three things. So let's look at an example using the who, how, why format. Adams compares a traveler to a river and evokes a high moral responsibility to encourage her son to make the most of his opportunities, particularly his trip to France. This would be a defensible thesis for question 2 for a few reasons. But first, let's talk about how it uses the who, how, why format. In this case, the who is Adams, Abigail Adams, which is from a previous year's prompt. The how, or rhetorical choices, are that she compares a traveler to a river and she evokes a high moral responsibility. And then the why is to encourage her son to make the most of his opportunities, particularly his trip to France with his father. This is a defensible thesis statement because it's appropriate to the task, because it has identified rhetorical choices and the outcome, but it's also specific. It's not just summarizing the letter that Abigail wrote to her son. Furthermore, it's arguable because I've taken a position on the choices that I think Abigail Adams used to convince her son. Let's try a practice in your notes. I've given you the who, how, and why, and I would like you to write an analytic thesis with the following components. For your example 1, your who is going to be Thomas Jefferson. The how is going to be listing grievances and parallelism, and the why, or purpose, is to sever ties with Britain. If you haven't figured it out, we're talking about the Declaration of Independence. Put those three elements into a defensible thesis statement in your notes. Now let's talk about a template that you can use for question 1 and 3, the synthesis and the argument. The task, loosely for these two, is to take a stance on an assigned topic, meaning that the writing is persuasive in nature. This is different than question 2 because question 2 is analytic in nature, asking you to take a position on the choices someone else has made in their writing. So the template needs to look a little different for these two questions. The template that I use is they say, however, blank. Therefore, I say. Let's break down those different elements. So let's break down each component of that template. The first part was the they say, and that's exactly what it sounds like. Here is what they, being the opposition, believe. This is where you present the counterclaim or counter-argument. Something like, some people might argue blah, blah, blah. That would be a they say, expressing what opposition believes. The second part of the template is the however blank. In this case, you fill the blank by previewing your line of reasoning. What are the reasons that you are going to use to establish your own position? Finally, the therefore I say is where you present your argument as the defensible thesis statement. Let's look at an example color-coded to show the different parts of that thesis template in action. There is general outcry that a college education is not worth the cost. However, this overlooks the long-term benefits of a degree and earning potential. Therefore, college is worth the cost. The first sentence, or phrase I should say, that's in light green, expresses the they say again. As you can tell by the finished statement, I am arguing that college is worth the cost. But in that first portion in light green, I'm acknowledging that not everyone feels that way, and that there is general outcry that college is not worth the cost. Once I've established the they say or the opposition, I use a switch word or however before previewing the main points I can make to refute that idea. In this case, those main ideas are that there are long-term benefits of a degree, and secondly, that there's greater earning potential. This middle part allows me to preview the main points or paragraphs that I'm going to use in my essay to develop my own stance. My own stance is what comes at the very end with the I say, and it says, therefore, college is worth the cost, which is in opposition to that first part of the thesis template. While the last sentence of this thesis is actually defensible on its own, I've presented the opposition as a way to preview how I'm going to structure my line of reasoning. All right, to finish our section on thesis writing, let's practice. In your notes, consider the prompt on the next slide. Compose a persuasive thesis using our template for question 1 and 3. Authors Poe Bronson and Ashley Merriman published The Creativity Crisis in Newsweek.com in July 2010. They reported that the Torrance test, a test of creativity that has been administered to millions of people worldwide in 50 languages, indicates that the public's creativity quotient has steadily crept downward since 1990. In their article, Bronson and Merriman cite the claim of Professor Kyung-hee Kim at the College of William and Mary. It's very clear and the decrease is very significant. Kim reports that it is the scores of younger children in America from kindergarten through 6th grade for whom the decline is most serious. Bronson and Merriman state that the potential consequences are sweeping. The necessity of human ingenuity is undisputed. A recent IBM poll of 1,500 CEOs identified creativity as their number one leadership competency of the future. Yet, it's not just about sustaining our nation's economic growth. All around us are matters of national and international importance that are crying out for creative solutions, from saving the Gulf of Mexico to bringing peace to Afghanistan to delivering health care. Such solutions emerge from a healthy marketplace of ideas sustained by a populace constantly contributing original ideas and receptive to the ideas of others. One possible approach to this reputed decline in creativity is to explicitly teach creative thinking in class. Write to your school board explaining what you mean by creativity and arguing for or against the creation of a class in creativity. All right, we've talked about how to analyze a rhetorical situation or prompt and how to write a defensible thesis statement. Now let's talk about developing the claims that support your thesis within an essay. There are infinite ways to write a paragraph or develop a claim, but every method of effectively developing a claim includes 3 components. The first is the claim itself, that the position is stated. The second is that evidence is provided to support that position. And third is commentary, which is provided to explain how the evidence supports that claim or position. Let's look at all 3 components in an example. I'm going to read through the entire paragraph, and then we'll break down each of the components: claim, evidence, and commentary. Homework is an outdated practice that only stifles students' potential. First, homework is meaningless without proper support and can lead to bad habits. Most people have sat down to do homework only to come across something they don't understand. If they proceed to the best of their ability, attempting to just get the homework done, they might learn the wrong methodology or process. While some teachers might argue that such practice is essential, it does little good if they are practicing doing the work wrong. Therefore, it becomes clear that due to the extra demands on today's teenagers and the concern of wrong practice, homework should be eliminated from daily instruction. So let's start with the claim, which I've highlighted in green. Homework is an outdated practice that only stifles students' potential. This is a very explicit position on whether homework is good or bad. It's really helpful if your claims can be explicit in academic writing because they establish a clear line of reasoning. Now let's look at the next component of an effective body paragraph, the evidence. Most people have sat down to do homework only to come across something they don't understand. If they proceed to the best of their ability, attempting to just get the homework done, they might learn the wrong methodology or process. Now, this is technically evidence. It's proposing a hypothetical situation to help support the idea that homework can be detrimental. Sometimes evidence can be a direct quote, sometimes it can be a very specific fact, and sometimes, like in this case, it's more of a hypothetical example to prove the point. The rest of the example is commentary, which is used to explain how that hypothetical example of doing the work wrong at home at night proves that homework is a bad practice. We're not going to dig into it too much because in a future unit, we're going to talk a lot about effective commentary. But I wanted you to show a full paragraph developing a claim from beginning to end. So now that you kind of identified the three components of developing a claim, let's talk about how we write an effective explicit claim. A claim should be defensible, just like a thesis statement. It should be specific, arguable, and appropriate to the overarching thesis. It needs to be explicit, meaning that it is direct and clear. This is especially important in academic or timed writing. And finally, they should be cohesive, meaning that they progress the reader through a line of reasoning. Let's take a look at how theses and claims should work together. The role of a claim is to develop a thesis. So all of the supporting claims should be directly aligned to the thesis you've written for the overall paper. So I've provided that from earlier in the video. There's a general outcry that a college education is not worth the cost. However, this overlooks the long-term benefits of a degree and earning potential. Therefore, college is worth the cost. If that's my thesis, the two claims that I kind of preview or allude to are the long-term benefits and earning potential. So therefore, it makes sense that two supporting claims I might use in my body paragraphs are: one, a college education has several long-term benefits, and two, furthermore, college graduates have higher earning potential over time. These two claims directly link to the thesis, and that means I'll be able to develop and support that thesis with well-developed claims in the body of my essay. So let's practice writing effective claims. Earlier in the video, I gave you a prompt, the creativity crisis prompt, and asked you to develop a thesis using our template for question 1 and 3. What I'd like you to do now is to support that thesis with two supporting claims. The prompt will be provided on the next slide. Now let's talk about evidence. The AP rubric specifies for the free response questions that you have specific, and relevant evidence. But it's also important that you always have the right quantity of evidence and quality evidence to support your claims. When talking about quantity, that is going to vary depending on two things. One, the purpose, or the amount needed to achieve your purpose. For example, if I am trying to convince an audience to make a huge change in their life, I'm probably going to need to provide more evidence than just, here's one example I saw of where it would be a good idea, right? You also need to consider the audience. Depending on who they are, they might need more or less evidence as well. Consider what's called a hostile audience. You're walking in to speak to a bunch of people who already hate you. In that situation, it's a hostile audience, and therefore they're probably going to need ample evidence if you're going to move them in any direction. That's why the quantity of evidence can vary depending on the rhetorical situation. You also need to think about the quality of the evidence, and that's more so what the AP rubric is looking at. Quality evidence is appropriate and relevant to the task, meaning that it makes sense. If you're talking about why we should not wear school uniforms, your evidence shouldn't necessarily be about homework rates, if that makes sense. That's not really relevant. Quality evidence is also timely, meaning that it's relevant in terms of when it was published. A lot of times, if you've done research work in the past, your teacher might put a cap on, oh, you can only use sources from the last 10 years. That's because a lot changes in 10 years. Quality evidence takes into effect the time and what's appropriate to the task. Quality evidence is also from an authoritative source, meaning that it's coming from somewhere credible, not just maybe something you pulled up on the internet. It should also be noted that the type of evidence you use on your free response questions is going to vary by question. For example, question 1, you are provided multiple sources from which you can pull your evidence. While you can bring in evidence from outside if it's relevant or pertinent to your argument, all of the material is provided in the source packet. For question 2, all of your evidence is going to come from the provided passage. Because you're analyzing the choices of the author, your evidence would be found in the final product. And third, for question 3, you are responsible for coming up with evidence all on your own. Now, you've probably learned along the way about integrating evidence, but you might not know why it's important to do so. When I say integrate evidence, I don't just mean adding evidence into your essay. I mean putting evidence in your essay and writing in a way that kind of merges your voice with the voice or ideas of someone else. Picture it this way. A lot of times you might hear from an English teacher that you have a dropped quote or a hanging quote. And what this means is I've gone to my article or my source, I've taken a quotation and I've just dropped it into my paper as an entire sentence standing on its own. The issue with this is that the rest of the paragraph is written in the speaker's voice or my voice as the writer. If I suddenly change to the ideas of someone else, even if I use those quotation marks to cite it, it can be jarring and disjointed. So when we talk about integrating evidence, we're actually just talking about transitioning from your ideas to the ideas of someone else. And there's 4 different ways to do that. The first is to paraphrase. What that means is I take the words of someone else and put it into my own words using specific details from the original source. I can also summarize. Summary is more so used when I need to condense a large source or idea and put it into my own words. I can also use a direct quote, but more importantly, I use a lead-in, something like, according to source A, and then proceed to use their words. Or you can kind of use a combination of those, which is kind of what a sophisticated writer does, which I like to call a semi-paraphrase, meaning that I might directly quote part of what the source says, but the sentence is still my own, and I'm still expressing it in my voice by paraphrasing some of what the writer said originally. Now, if you want to pause the screen, you'll notice the second column provides instances when it might be appropriate to use the different methods. Let's go ahead and practice how we can integrate evidence. In your notes, correct the highlighted dropped quotation in this example on the screen. Use one of the methods we just covered, which include paraphrase, summary, lead-in, or semi-paraphrase, to integrate this evidence so that it more smoothly transitions from the speaker's words into the direct quote. Writing defensible thesis statements and developing your claims is no easy task, and this very long video is enough to prove it. On the next slide, I've provided a few review questions to make sure that you've really understood the entire process.